And that was very beautiful. Quite fitting to our theme of joy for this month. And there's a verse in this text that Sandy had read that I would guess is probably highlighted in an awful lot of people's Bibles. This verse that's in Jeremiah 29, it's in verse 11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." How many of you have either received something that has this verse on it, or given something away with this verse on it, or you have encouraged people with this verse in some way? How many of you have ever, maybe some of you have something sitting on your dresser or hanging in your home right now with this verse on it? Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of you. It's often used at graduation. I remember receiving this when I graduated from high school. It's kind of a timeless promise. And we had this just really beautiful rendition of the hymn to joy. And yet this story is so full of not joy. We give this, if we would, let's say, just take a literal reading of this verse and the verses around it. What are you, about 18 years old when you graduate from high school? And somebody gives you this verse, and you go home and look at this and say, okay, yeah, God has plans for me, plans to prosper me, not to harm me, give me a hope and a future. But then just a few verses before, it says, when 70 years are completed. So when you're 18 plus 70, so when you're 88, if you make it that far, that God is going to reveal His plans for you. It's like, wow, that's depressing. That's as bad as that statement that your college years are going to be the best years of your life. Are they really? It's like, man, that is depressing too, to think. So it's just going to be hardship from here on. But it just really is an honest look about life, and what we experience is what this is about, and a tremendous promise of God being with us in transition, no matter what happens to us or where we're going, where we end up. And I want to tell you a little bit of how the sermon title came to be. The best city in the world is where you are. We had an interfaith council gathering this last week. Arnita was there. She led that for us this week. And Pastor Sang, who is the new pastor over at the United Methodist Church, this was the first time that I had met him. He was there with us. And it's really hard to pronounce his name because it's a tonal name. He said that S-A-N-G isn't really right. S-U-N-G isn't really right. It's something sort of like song. And I can't say that. If you haven't grown up with that tonal language, it's very hard to get that pronunciation right. But I talked to him for quite a while afterwards, after the meeting, because it's just interesting. He's from Korea, and how does he end up here in Halstead? And he shared with me a little bit of how much transition they have been in. He had no intention of ever pastoring in the United States. He had planted a church in Korea. He and his wife worked in that church very hard for 10 years. They never took a salary, never had payment. The church grew. At the end of the 10 years, he was a bit burnt out, was looking for something a little bit different, even though at that point they could offer him a parsonage and a salary, but he and his family decided to come to the United States so that he could learn English much better. And he ended up studying, to his surprise, at Asbury Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. It's a United Methodist seminary there. And it was out of that experience that he ended up being invited to Chanute, Kansas, to pastor, and from there he went to Junction City because they had a Korean American church there, and with him being fluent in both languages, they really wanted him to be there for a little while, and now he is here just down the street from us. And we were sharing a little bit of our experience of moving around, and because I've moved a lot, and he said, well, we've moved 8 times. He has a sophomore in the Halstead school system here and a 7th grader. And he said, he and his family have just decided, there's a lot of different choices. You come out of seminary, you have all these choices, and he said, we prayed to God that we'll take the first church that offers us a position. And he said it was the location in Chanute, Kansas. And he said there were some in New York, there were some in the Carolinas, some in Illinois. He was getting offers from all over that on paper looked so much better than the first one. But he decided that this is what we prayed, we're going to remain faithful to that, and he and his family to Chanute, Kansas, and he said it was a great experience. He said that was the best city. And he said, and that just convinced him, you know what? If we're following God, walking with God, the best place we can be, the best city that we can be is right where we are. That takes a lot of faith to say that, depending on what your situation is and how difficult you're finding the place where you are right now. But that's exactly what God is asking the exiles from Judah to do. They have been taken from their home, and this is not just that they're misplaced. When a conquering nation would take out, like a Judah, they would be trying to disrupt their culture so that they couldn't be a cohesive people. So that meant that some would be taken back to Babylon, some would be left there, some would end up in Egypt, some would end up in other parts of the region. They would be a diaspora. They would just be scattered everywhere. And they wouldn't just let them be just all to themselves. They would try to keep them so that they had to be sort of separated and among their culture so that they would become acculturated to the empire that had brought them into exile. One writer that I was reading said, if you want to try to get an idea of what this would be like, just imagine if Iran invaded the United States and took us to Tehran, and God said, First Mennonite, I want you to settle here. I want you to build. You're going to be here for a long time. Your children are going to grow up here. Your grandchildren are going to be born here. They are going to grow up here. It's going to be 70 years, and it's unclear whether that just means figuratively the perfect number of 7, God's number, so that it's like the completion of God's work and God's will, or whether it's a literal 70 years. But the point being, they're going to be here a while. This congregation should really be in touch with what that means to be an immigrant and to be somewhere for 70 years. Because you have to face the fact that we can preserve our culture for a while. First generation is going to learn the language from the parents. There's some of you here who know the German, the High German. It's High German, is that right? That would be with this group? No, that's not. It's the Low German? It's high, okay. Well, my background is Pennsylvania Dutch, and so I don't know where that one falls. But there are just different dialects that all of us have had from our immigrant families when we have come, and we can hang on to that for a while. And like most of the churches in the area, the home language was, the native language is what was used. But eventually, after you have that first generation being born and raised, they have a generation that is born and raised that doesn't know anything about Judah or the homeland. What they grow up knowing is this. And Pastor Sang even talked about that a little bit, and he said that his hope for his daughters is that he just loves that they really enjoy the Halstead school system. They're having a great time. And he just wants them to be able to really give their gifts and invest themselves in this country, if that is where God calls them. But you begin to feel this, I hope, a little bit, that you have been ripped away from your homeland, and there isn't anything more you want to do than just go back as soon as you can. And there were false prophets. Hananiah, one of them, who just in the previous passage was saying, don't listen to all of this message, this being a long time here. It's not going to be. In 2 years, God's going to restore everything, and even bringing the artifacts that Babylon stole, some of their most precious things that they had, probably from the temple, probably from all of the wealth of the city. They plundered it. We're going to be able to take that back with us. And then this is Jeremiah's response from God saying, that's not how it's going to be. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to the good news prophets. I want you to build. I want you to plant. I want you to marry. I want you to give your children in marriage. I want you to settle. Now think about that a little bit. When God is saying that I have plans for you, I believe he's talking about the 70 years. That is a part of what he is planning, but they're not going to be able to receive that if they don't embrace it and really kind of take a vow of stability. To say, okay, God, we'll do that. We will invest ourselves here. We'll build. We'll plant trees and vineyards and gardens, and we'll eat. We'll give our children in marriage. We will let them marry. God doesn't qualify who they give to, who they're given in marriage to, or who they marry. And a lot of them did end up marrying people from Babylon and had, I guess you would say, a mixed marriage out of that. That is a pretty tough thing to say to not just a family group or an immigrant group, but this was a national power. They were sovereign. And they're going to have to let go of that sovereignty and say, you know what, we're not going to be in control anymore. That is really hard for most any American to accept, that we can't use our wealth and our power to say how things are going to be. But that is what Judah was going to have to live with if they were going to embrace what God was asking of them. It doesn't seem like it's punishment just for the sake of punishment. It seems as though God is wanting to mature them and work in them another renewed vision for who God is calling them to be. And is it possible? I mean, God's original idea was for Israel, and then it was Israel and Judah to be a light to other nations. Is it possible that they became so self-absorbed in their wealth, they forgot their mission, and in this diaspora, God spread them all out, all over the world, all over that region, so that God's light could shine in all of those different cracks? We don't know what all God was thinking, but it's a mistake to think that when we see something that needs to be done, or a certain direction that we want to go, let's say as a church, to think that it is just up to us and our sovereign will. This passage is saying it's not. You can let go of that. You can settle in. This is where you are. This is where God has placed you. God is at work in ways that you don't quite know or understand. And he's asking them, and I believe God asks us, to have not just hope, but a courageous hope. Because you have to have some courage to begin to build in a place that's not your home, that's completely new. To believe that something good is going to come out of it. Because if you don't, you're always going to be holding back just a little bit. I mean, you just think about college experiences, and I've heard this a lot where Heston College was one of them where in the first semester a lot of people felt like it just didn't quite gel for some of them, but then they talk about, I've heard this before, then coming back after Christmas the second semester, it's almost like people went back home and were starting to weigh what they had now and what was back home, and then they and somehow kind of made peace with the fact that I'm at Heston, and in the second semester that it felt like everybody's finally here. We're all finally actually on campus together. I want to go back to this message about graduates. There's a way in which I think when we graduate from high school or college that we think we should just know where we're headed. And that we just try to fulfill our passions. And then a lot of people really sit with wondering, boy, did I miss it? And this is an encouragement from this passage that is saying, I'm there with you no matter what happens to you after you graduate. I'm going to be with you. It's not all about you. I'm working out some plans. Are you willing to just trust and invest where you are and follow me? And giving up this control. Wednesday night we're doing a study where we're talking a little bit about what it means to follow Jesus right where we are. And I showed a picture on Wednesday evening that had this statement, and it was not from a church, but it said, it was a picture of an outdoor sign, like at a business, and as you drive by it, then it said, ask about the neighbors first, then buy the house. And I wanted people to wrestle with that. But what would you think if that sign was out by our church here? What if that was our message? We ask about the neighbors first, then buy the house. To me, it just has that implicit thing of control that we have such a hard time letting go of. That I want to know what my neighbors are like before I move into a neighborhood. And then sometimes after we get settled, and maybe we've lived there for 20 years, and the houses change ownership, and all of a sudden neighbors have all changed. Didn't matter whether you asked about the neighbors first or not. You're sitting there with people that you wish you could exile to Babylon. And God is putting another verse with this that is really important for us to remember, that I don't think you can take that. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future. You can't separate that verse from the other one, which says to seek the welfare of the city where you are. God even says to pray for them. Pray for your neighbors. Pray for those around you that they prosper. That in their prosperity, you will find your prosperity. Now think about this phrase. What if we as a community, as a nation, could adopt this phrase? Because we hear all the time this thing about security. We want to be secure in our home. We want to be secure as a country. We worry about our neighbors across the backyard, our fence, and we worry about our neighbors down south or anybody else who's immigrating from countries that we don't trust so much. There's another definition for security that I think touches on this a little bit more closely, which is you are only as secure as your neighbor. We're only as secure as our neighbor. And I believe that's a lot of the reason why Jesus told us to love them. Because we need each other. And it's only in each other's welfare that each of us will find our own welfare. So what do you think about, I promised Leah an hour and 5 minutes. We're at an hour and 5 minutes. We talked about that last Sunday, and I told her she could hold me accountable. It's okay. I'm almost done. Because I want to finish my story with Pastor Sang. I just had so much fun talking to him, because you just don't know what God is doing on the other side of the conversation. I just heard that there was a pastor from Korea that moved in here, and that doesn't mean a lot to me. But when I heard his story, and when you talk to other people, don't forget that God is at work in their life. God doesn't start working when you visit somebody in the park or across the street when you show up and start talking to them. God has been working with them long before that. It's just that you now maybe can enter into the conversation with what God is doing. And Pastor Sang told me that when he got over here and they were planning to learn English, he said that he was ready to go back because it just wasn't going well. They were running out of resources, and his wife encouraged him to just stay another couple months. And then he met a man, a seminary professor at the church he was attending, named Art McPhee. And Art, as he got to know Sang, encouraged him, like, why don't you take this further than just learning English? Come to Asbury and study. And Sang didn't think that that was even worth a shot. His English was not that good yet. He wasn't sure if he could do the work. And Art encouraged him to do it anyway. Sang got in. He attended. He's working on his PhD. He's finishing that up right now. And Art and his wife, Evie, became Sang's mentors. And he became very close to them. And he said they were the only people that they really felt they're comfortable with their daughters staying with overnight. Well, what's so fascinating to me about this is that Art and Evie are people that I know. Evie is married to Luann. This gets bad, I know, but it's Luann's sister's husband. Evie is his sister. And that's kind of how we know them. But then it goes a little bit further because of how well Sang and his wife know Art and Evie. They also knew about their son, who just, it wasn't very many years ago, was diagnosed with, I don't know if it was even 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, diagnosed with a brain tumor. And so I knew about that from my brother-in-law, because he's somebody I'm pretty close to, and he's very close to Art and Evie. And they were just feeling this grief that way around. And Sang was feeling the grief from his way around. And their son died earlier this year. But here I just think that it's a pastor from Korea that I have no connection to, and we're standing out in front of the United Methodist Church sharing a grief over somebody we both know. So when you have somebody new move in beside you, or there's somebody new at work, new in church, whatever this case might be, it's very natural for all of us to just sort of read the initial signs and, the assumptions that we make and forget that this person has a story. And God is working with them in ways that we don't know. But what a joy it was to we talked for an hour after the meeting. Somebody that I never thought that I would really feel a connection to. So yes, I do believe God has plans for us. Plans for you, plans for the high school and college graduates. I do think it also is up to us to invest in prayer for those who are around us. It's something for us to do to really consider what does it mean to build, to be fully present, and invest ourselves and our times and our talents so that not just for our own prosperity, but we're also helping each other to prosper, because that is the way that we really get a true sense of well-being and security and our own prosperity. The praise team is going to lead us in a response song that is a new one to me, but the words are really powerful. And it may be new to you too. If it is, I would just say we'll do the best we can with it.